I was up to my elbows in grease when the local HOA president threatened to have me arrested for painting my own front door. She stood on my driveway, dialing 911 with a smug, tight-lipped grin. What she didn't realize, the cops weren't going to arrest me, because legally I owned her. The heat that August was the kind that possessed a physical weight. It pressed down on your shoulders, settled in the small of your back, and made the air smell like roasting asphalt and ozone. I was kneeling on the cracked concrete of my driveway, a flathead screwdriver in one hand and a rag soaked in mineral spirits in the other. I was trying to scrape decades of baked-on grime off a salvaged cast-iron mailpost. My knuckles were scraped. Sweat stung the corners of my eyes, blurring my vision. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was mine. I'd bought this place, a run-down mid-century ranch, sitting on a weirdly shaped remnant of land, 3 months ago at a county tax auction. It was a chaotic, overgrown island, entirely surrounded by a sea of pristine cookie-cutter McMansions. The subdivision was called Whispering Pines, a name that felt like a joke considering the developers had clear-cut every single pine tree in a 3-mile radius to build it. I wiped a streak of grease across my forehead and leaned back, my knees popping loudly in the quiet afternoon. That's when I heard it, the high-pitched electric whine of a golf cart. It didn't belong on the main road, but there it was, creeping along the shoulder before taking a sharp, jerky turn right onto my property. It rolled to a stop an inch from my toolbox. A woman stepped out. She didn't walk, she marched. She wore a pale pink tennis skirt, a white visor that looked aggressively clean, and a scent that hit me like a physical blow. Something cloying and intensely floral, like cheap lavender air freshener pumped through a hot car vent. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was thin, reedy, and vibrating with an authority she clearly believed was absolute. I didn't stand up right away. My lower back was throbbing. I squinted up at her against the glare of the afternoon sun. "Can I help you?" "I'm Diane," she said, as if that single word was supposed to unlock some deep well of reverence in me. She tapped a clipboard against her thigh. "President of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and we need to have a serious talk about this." She gestured vaguely at my entire existence. The rusted mailpost, my 2004 Ford Ranger parked on grass. The front door I'd painted a deep, oceanic blue just yesterday. "Okay," I said slowly. I finally stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of self-consciousness. I was covered in dirt, smelling of sweat and chemical solvents. She looked like she'd just been unwrapped from cellophane. The class divide was a physical thing standing between us on the hot concrete. "The truck on the lawn is a Class A violation," Diane rattled off, not looking at me but at her clipboard. "The paint color on the door is unapproved. We only permit muted earth tones, specifically Navajo white, desert sand, or sage, and your grass is at least 2 inches above the community maximum. I'm issuing a written warning today, but frankly, I should go straight to fines." She reached into a plastic organizer on her clipboard, produced a neon green slip of paper, and extended it toward me. I just stared at it. "I think you're lost, Diane." Her hand dropped a fraction. Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" I said, "I think you're lost." I pointed my flathead screwdriver toward the manicured lawns across the street. "Whispering Pines is over there, and behind me, and to the left. I'm not in your HOA." Diane let out a sound that was half laugh, half scoff. It was a thoroughly practiced noise. "Oh, please, don't try that. Every property within the perimeter gates is part of the association. You bought the old Miller place. The previous owner was a holdout for a while, but he signed the incorporation papers years ago before he lost the house. It's in the bylaws." She was so confident it made my stomach drop for a second. Had I messed up? When I bought the property at the auction, the paperwork was a mess. A thick manila folder of legal jargon, quitclaim deeds, and blurry boundary lines. But I had checked. I had paid a paralegal $300 I couldn't afford, just to make sure. "No," I said, forcing my voice to stay level. My heart was starting to thump, that heavy, uncomfortable thud that comes with confrontation. The previous owner signed an easement for the access road. He never joined the HOA. I own this lot free and clear. Diane's face hardened. The tight, polite smile vanished, replaced by something genuinely mean. I know your type. You buy a cheap foreclosure and think you can drag down the property values of a premium neighborhood. You have 48 hours to move the truck, repaint the door, and mow this jungle. Or the daily fines start at $200. She slapped the green paper under the windshield wiper of my truck. The sound of the paper snapping against the glass was loud in the dead heat. Anger, hot and sudden, flared in my chest. I walked over to the truck, pulled the paper from under the wiper, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it into the bed of the truck. "Don't touch my vehicle again," I said. My voice was lower this time, shaking a little. I hated that it shook. Diane took a step back, her eyes widening, not in fear, but in a kind of predatory thrill. She had her opening. "Are you threatening me?" she asked, her voice raising an octave. "I'm telling you to get off my property." "This is HOA property," she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at the ground. "You are in violation, and you are acting hostile." She reached into the pocket of her tennis skirt and pulled out her phone. Her thumbs flew across the screen. "What are you doing?" I asked, a cold knot forming in my gut, despite the 100-degree heat. "I'm calling the police," she said, raising the phone to her ear. She looked me dead in the eye, her lips curling into a smirk. "We'll see who owns what when you're in handcuffs for trespassing and threatening an association officer." I stood there, a dirty rag in one hand, watching this woman invent a reality to ruin my day. I wanted to yell. I wanted to snatch the phone. But I just stood still, feeling the sweat drip down my spine, listening to her tell the dispatcher that an aggressive man was terrorizing her in her own neighborhood. The wait was agonizing. Time slows down to a crawl when you're waiting for the police, especially when you know you haven't done anything wrong. But the person who called them looks like she belongs, and you look like you don't. Diane had retreated to her golf cart, sitting in the shade of its canopy with her arms crossed, sipping from a Stanley cup she'd produced from a cup holder. She didn't look at me. She just stared straight ahead, a general surveying a battlefield she had already won. I paced. The gravel crunched loudly beneath my boots. The heat radiating off the driveway felt like an open oven door. I kept wiping my hands on my jeans, trying to get the grease off, trying to look less like a vagrant and more like a homeowner. My mind raced through the auction documents. Did I miss a rider, a subclause? The county clerk had handed me a stack of papers so thick it needed a rubber band. What if Diane was right? 10 minutes later, a white SUV with blue details rolled slowly down the street. It didn't have its sirens on, but the light bar flashed silently, painting the manicured trees and my unapproved blue door in harsh, strobing colors. The cruiser pulled up behind Diane's golf cart. The door opened with a heavy, metallic clunk. The officer who stepped out looked tired. He was a thick-set guy in his 40s, his uniform shirt dark with sweat under his Kevlar vest. He adjusted his duty belt, the leather creaking, and let out a long breath. "Afternoon, Diane," the officer said. He knew her. Of course he knew her. "Officer Miller," Diane said, her voice instantly transforming from shrill to a soft, distressed flutter. She stepped out of the cart, wringing her hands. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I was just terrified. I came over to issue a simple community warning, and he—" She pointed at me, her finger trembling slightly. "He became verbally abusive. He threw things. He refused to identify himself, and he's trespassing on an active residential lot." I felt my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. "I didn't throw anything. I threw your fake ticket into my own truck bed, and I live here." The officer held up a heavy, calloused hand. "Hold on. One at a time." He looked at me, his eyes scanning my dirty clothes, the scattered tools, the half-scraped mail post. "You have ID on you, son." "It's inside," I said, "along with the deed to this property." "He's lying," Diane cut in sharply. "This lot is under the jurisdiction of Whispering Pines. We have an injunction against unapproved modifications. He's a squatter." The officer sighed, a sound that carried the weight of 1,000 petty neighborhood disputes. "Go get your ID," he told me, "and whatever paperwork you think you have." I turned and walked to the house. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the blue door. Inside, the air conditioning was broken. The house smelled faintly of old wood, dust, and the bleach I'd been using to scrub the bathroom. It felt like the tomb. I went to the kitchen counter where my important box sat. I dug through receipts, old mail, and half-empty matchbooks until my fingers found the thick, heavy manila envelope from the county clerk. I pulled it out. I opened it on the counter, my grease-stained fingers leaving dark smudges on the crisp white edges of the legal documents. I found the title, I found the deed, and then I found the surveyor's map, the one the paralegal had highlighted in yellow. I stared at it. I had looked at it before, but mostly just to confirm the boundaries of my little half-acre. Now I looked closer at the surrounding lines. The auction had bundled my house, Parcel 4A, with an attached remnant of land, Parcel 4B. The county had sold them as a single lot because the original developer went bankrupt and defaulted on the property taxes. I traced the yellow line with my finger. It outlined my house. Then it extended outward. It ran down the driveway, crossed the street, and encompassed a massive rectangular block right in the middle of the subdivision. My brow furrowed. I looked at the legend. I looked at the map again. Parcel 4B wasn't just an empty field. According to the overlay, it was the exact footprint of the Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse, the neighborhood pool, and the front security gates. The original developer hadn't sold that land to the HOA. He had kept it and leased it to them. When he went under, the county seized it for back taxes, and when I bought the foreclosure, I bought the dirt. I bought the land the HOA sat on. A weird, tight feeling expanded in my chest. It wasn't joy. It was more like the dizzying drop of a roller coaster. I wasn't just a neighbor. I held the master lease. I grabbed the map, the deed, and my driver's license and walked back out into the blinding heat. Diane was leaning against the police cruiser, chatting amicably with the officer. She shot me a smug look as I approached. I handed my ID to the officer. Arthur, he read aloud. He looked at the address. Matches the house. He probably forged it, Diane muttered, though she sounded a little less certain now. And this, I said, my voice remarkably steady as I handed the heavy stack of papers over, is the deed and the county survey, stamped and notarized 3 months ago. The officer took the papers. He flipped through them, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. He paused at the survey map. He looked at it. Then he looked at the clubhouse sitting grandly on a hill about 200 yards away. He looked back at the map. A slow, confused frown spread across his face. He pulled a pen from his breast pocket and used the tip to trace the yellow lines, just like I had. Diane, the officer said slowly, his voice dropping an octave. Yes, she said, stepping forward, ready for my arrest. Who owns the community center? Diane blinked. The association, obviously. Well, we leased the land from the original development trust on a 99-year contract, but the development trust that went into tax receivership last year? The officer asked. Yes, we've been paying our ground lease to the county escrow. The officer closed the folder. He looked at Diane. Then he looked at me. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Well, Diane, the officer said, handing the folder back to me. Looks like you don't pay the county anymore. You pay him. He owns Parcel 4B. The silence that followed was absolute. The cicadas in the distance seemed to stop buzzing. Diane stared at the officer. The color drained from her face, leaving her spray tan looking violently orange against her pale skin. Her mouth opened, closed, and opened again. What? He owns the land under your clubhouse, Diane, the officer said, clearly enjoying this now. And the pool, and the gates. Technically, if he wanted to, he could tow your golf cart for parking on his grass. I stood there, feeling the heavy, hot air suddenly feel a little lighter. I looked at the neon green slip of paper still sitting crumpled in the bed of my truck. Then I looked at Diane. About that fine, I said. The police cruiser pulled away, its tires hissing against the hot asphalt. The silence it left behind was thick and suffocating. Diane stood paralyzed beside her golf cart. The smug certainty that had propped up her posture just 5 minutes ago was entirely gone, leaving her looking deflated, like a balloon slowly leaking air. She stared at the spot where the cruiser had been, her mouth a tight, pale line. "This is a mistake," she finally said. Her voice lacked its previous volume. It sounded brittle. "The county made a clerical error. That land belongs to Whispering Pines." "It belongs to whoever pays the taxes, Diane," I said. My voice was steady, but inside my stomach was executing a slow, nauseating roll. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a cold, jittery sweat. "And the county sold it to me." She didn't argue. She didn't threaten me with fines or jail time. She just turned, climbed stiffly into her golf cart, and drove away. She didn't even look back. The electric whine of the motor faded down the street, swallowed by the drone of the cicadas. I stood in my driveway alone. I looked down at the heavy manila folder in my hands. The paper felt damp where my sweaty fingers gripped it. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sick. In movies, this is the part where the underdog does a victory lap. In reality, owning commercial property attached to a hostile homeowners association is a terrifying financial liability. What if someone drowned in the pool? What if the clubhouse roof caved in? Was I insured for that? I had bought a cheap foreclosure to fix up and live in quietly. Now I accidentally owned the infrastructure of a multi-million-dollar subdivision, and I had exactly $400 in my checking account. I went inside, locked the blue door, and sat at my kitchen table. The house was stifling. I drank a glass of lukewarm tap water, staring at the surveyor's map until the yellow lines blurred. Then, I picked up my phone and started searching for a lawyer who wouldn't demand a $5,000 retainer. I found one 2 days later. His name was Finch. His office was in a dying strip mall sandwiched between a discount vape shop and a struggling nail salon. The waiting room smelled overwhelmingly of acrylic fumes and old carpet dust. Finch was a thin, tired-looking man with a chronically loosened tie and a desk buried under leaning towers of case files. He didn't look like a shark. He looked like a guy who drank too much antacid. But when I handed him the deed, the lease agreement I'd pulled from the county records, and the surveyor's map, his eyes sharpened. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the office was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the crisp turning of pages. I sat in a pleather chair that hissed every time I shifted my weight. I picked at a spot of dried blue paint on my thumb. "Well," Finch finally said, leaning back. The springs in his chair groaned. "You weren't kidding. You own Parcel 4B. "And the liability?" I asked, my chest tight. "If some kid slips by the pool?" "The HOA holds the primary insurance policy as the lessee," Finch said, dragging a finger down a dense page of legalese. They indemnify the landowner. That's standard. But here's where it gets interesting." He tapped the paper with the blunt end of a cheap ballpoint pen. "This lease was signed in 1998 by the original developer, 99 years. Rent was set at $3,000 a month, payable to the development trust." "Which went bankrupt," I said. "Right. When the trust dissolved, the property went into tax receivership. The HOA was supposed to pay that $3,000 into a county escrow account, but..." Finch pulled a printout I had gotten from the county clerk's office that morning. "According to this ledger, the HOA hasn't made a ground lease payment in 14 months. I frowned. Why? Who knows? Maybe they thought because the developer vanished, no one was checking. Maybe your friend Diane decided to allocate those funds elsewhere. But the lease has a default clause, 60 days of non-payment, and the landowner can issue a cure or quit notice. They either pay the arrears immediately, or the lease is terminated, and the land reverts to your absolute control." I did the math in my head. 14 months, $3,000 a month. "They owe $42,000, I said softly. "To the county," Finch corrected. "But since you bought the deed, they owe you the rent from the date of purchase. That's 3 months, $9,000. And if they can't pay the county the back taxes they skipped out on, the county will likely penalize them. But you hold the right to terminate the lease right now for breach of contract." Finch looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "So the question is, what do you want to do? You can let them keep the lease and just demand your $9,000, or you can break the lease, lock the gates, and negotiate an entirely new contract at today's market rate, which, for a commercial facility of that size, is closer to $8,000 a month." My heart hammered against my ribs. I thought about the neon green violation ticket. I thought about Diane standing on my driveway, smiling as she dialed 911, ready to ruin my life over a shade of paint. "Draft the notice," I said. My voice shook a little. I cleared my throat. "Draft the default notice. I want to hand deliver it." The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association held its monthly board meetings on the second Tuesday of every month. I arrived at the clubhouse at exactly 7 p.m. The building was a sprawling faux Tuscan monstrosity, with stucco walls and clay roof tiles. As I walked up the stamped concrete path, I could smell the heavy chemical scent of chlorine from the Olympic-sized pool out back. I pushed open the heavy double-glass doors. The air conditioning hit me like a physical wall, chilling the sweat on my neck. The lobby floor was polished travertine. My heavy work boots squeaked against it, the sound echoing loudly in the cavernous space. The meeting was in the community room. About 30 folding chairs were set up facing a long folding table. Half the chairs were filled with residents, mostly older folks looking bored, and a few tense-looking couples holding folders of their own. Behind the long table sat the board. There were 4 of them. Diane sat dead center. She was wearing a sharp, navy blue blazer. She held a gavel, an actual wooden gavel. As I walked down the center aisle, the low murmur of neighborhood gossip abruptly died out. 30 pairs of eyes locked onto me. I was wearing clean jeans and a button-down shirt, but I still felt like an intruder. My hands were clammy. I gripped the black leather binder Finch had given me so tightly, my knuckles ached. Diane saw me. Her posture instantly went rigid. Her eyes darted toward the exits, then back to me. She banged the gavel once. It sounded thin and hollow in the large room. "Excuse me," Diane said. Her voice projected across the room, shrill and commanding. "This meeting is for Whispering Pines homeowners only. Non-residents are not permitted to attend." I stopped at the front row of empty chairs. I didn't sit. I just stood there, looking at her. "I'm not a resident, Diane. You made that perfectly clear." "Then you need to leave," a red-faced man sitting to Diane's right barked. He had thick white hair and a golf shirt stretched tight over a large stomach. "Before we call security." "You don't have security," I said. "You have a gate code, and I'm not leaving. I have business with the board." "You have no business here," Diane snapped, her composure cracking. She stood up, her hands flat on the table. "I will not let you harass us. Gary, call the police." The red-faced man, Gary, reached for his phone. "Call them," I said, my voice louder than I intended. It echoed. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in my chest. "Call Officer Miller again. I'm sure he'd love to explain this to you all over again in front of the whole neighborhood." A murmur rippled through the seated residents. People shifted in their squeaky metal chairs. "Explain what?" a woman in the second row asked, frowning at Diane. Diane ignored her. "Gary, dial the number." I unzipped the black leather binder. I pulled out a stack of paper, stapled at the corner, and tossed it onto the folding table. It slid across the plastic surface and stopped inches from Diane's hands. "That is a formal notice of default," I said. I looked at the rest of the board. "My name is Arthur. 3 months ago I purchased Parcel 4B at a county tax auction. Parcel 4B is the land we are currently standing on. I am the legal owner of this clubhouse, the pool, the tennis courts, and the front gates." Complete silence fell over the room. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, pressing against your eardrums. Gary paused, his thumb hovering over his phone screen. "He's lying," Diane hissed. But she didn't touch the paperwork. She shrank back from it like it was radioactive. "It's public record," I said, looking at Gary. "You can check it right now on your phone. County clerk's website. Parcel 4B. Gary slowly put down his phone. He picked up the paperwork. He adjusted his reading glasses and began to read. As his eyes moved down the page, his red face turned a peculiar shade of purple. "Diane," Gary said softly. He didn't look up. "What is this? It says we haven't paid the ground lease in 14 months. "The trust dissolved," Diane deflected, her voice pitching higher. "The account was frozen. I was advised to hold the funds until a new entity claimed the lease. Advised by who? Another board member, a thin woman with severe glasses, asked sharply. We approve those payments in the budget every month, Diane. Where's the money? It's in the reserve account, Diane fired back, sweat beading on her forehead. I moved it to cover the landscaping overages on the south cul-de-sac. The south cul-de-sac, where Diane lived. The room exploded. Homeowners were out of their chairs, shouting. Gary was yelling at Diane. The severe woman was frantically flipping through a ledger binder. I stood there amidst the chaos, feeling a strange detachment. I wasn't enjoying it. It was ugly. It was just desperate people fighting over manicured lawns and artificial prestige. I waited for the noise to die down. When it didn't, I slapped the flat of my hand hard against the plastic folding table. The sharp crack silenced the room. I don't care about your landscaping, I said. My voice was low, but it carried in the quiet. Here is the reality. You owe me $9,000 for the last 3 months of rent, and because you are in breach of contract for non-payment, the original lease is void. I am issuing a 30-day cure or quit notice. We'll pay the $9,000, Gary said quickly, wiping his brow. We can issue a special assessment. We'll get you the money. It's not just the $9,000, I said. The old lease is dead. If you want to keep using this building, the pool and the gates, the new rent is $8,000 a month, plus the arrears. Gary looked like he had been punched in the stomach. $8,000. We can't afford that without doubling the HOA dues. Then you better start voting, I said. I zipped up my empty binder. I looked at Diane. She was staring at the table, her face ashen, her hands trembling. All the artificial authority had been stripped away, leaving an exhausted, terrified woman who had played a stupid game and lost entirely. You have 30 days, I told the board. If the arrears aren't in my attorney's escrow account by the 1st of next month and a new lease isn't signed, I will padlock the gates, drain the pool, and turn this clubhouse into a storage facility. I turned and walked back down the center aisle. No one tried to stop me. No one said a word. The only sound was the squeak of my work boots on the expensive floor they no longer controlled. 30 days is a brutal sentence when you're waiting for a wealthy neighborhood to crush you. I spent the month tearing out the rotted kitchen cabinets in my house, letting the physical labor drown out my escalating paranoia. Every time a car drove past, my chest tightened. I expected a process server to march up my driveway with a thick stack of injunctions. I expected a lawsuit that would drain my pathetic checking account and leave me homeless. I breathed in sawdust and the sharp, chemical tang of wood stain, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But my phone didn't ring. No one knocked on my unapproved blue door. According to Finch, the silence was just the sound of a structural collapse. Diane had been ousted from the board in a screaming match that supposedly lasted 3 hours, but firing her didn't magically materialize the $42,000 they owed the county, nor the $9,000 they owed me. The residents had flat out mutinied. They refused a special assessment to cover Diane's embezzlement, or misallocation, as she kept calling it. On the 31st day, my alarm went off at 4:30 a.m. The house was freezing. I stood over the sink, drinking instant coffee that tasted like burnt copper, shivering in a faded flannel shirt. I felt heavy, nauseous, and deeply tired. I didn't want to do this. I wanted to stay inside, sand my drywall, and pretend the massive faux Tuscan clubhouse up the hill didn't belong to me. But you can't make a threat to a viper pit and then flinch. If I backed down now, they would smell blood, reorganize, and drag me into litigation hell. I grabbed a canvas duffel bag. It clanked loudly, filled with 30 pounds of thick steel chains and heavy-duty master locks. I drove my truck up the street, the engine a low, rough growl in the pre-dawn quiet. The neighborhood was dead. The community center looked ghostly in the yellow glow of the security lamps. A monument to artificial prestige, casting long, weird shadows across the manicured lawns. I parked dead center in the fire lane. I started with the pool. The air was damp, smelling of wet earth, crushed pine needles, and stale chlorine. The cold metal gate rattled loudly as I wrapped a thick chain around the handles. I threaded the padlock, squeezed it shut, and the heavy, metallic click echoed off the stucco walls. It sounded terribly final. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like vandalism. I moved to the tennis courts. chain, padlock, click. I was walking toward the main double doors of the clubhouse, a power drill in one hand to install a new steel hasp, when a pair of headlights swept over the dark parking lot. The beams washed over me, blindingly bright before cutting out. A silver Lexus idled in the spot next to my truck. The driver's door opened with a heavy, expensive thud. Gary stepped out. He looked a decade older than he had at the board meeting. The golf course tan had faded into a sickly, exhausted gray. He was wearing rumpled sweatpants and a windbreaker, his white hair sticking up in odd patches. He walked up the stamped concrete path, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The silence between us stretched out, filled only by the distant hum of the highway miles away. "Morning," Gary said. His voice was raw, like he'd spent the night swallowing glass. "Gary," I replied. I let the drill drop to my side, the weight of it suddenly pulling at my shoulder socket. He stopped a few feet away, staring at the thick steel chain I'd just locked around the pool gate. He stared at it for a long time. Then he let out a slow, ragged breath that seemed to deflate his entire chest. "You don't need to drill the front doors," Gary said quietly. He pulled a thick, heavy brass key ring from his windbreaker and held it out across the dark space between us. "I brought the master keys." I hesitated. My fingers were stiff from the cold. I reached out and took them. The brass was freezing. "We couldn't get the votes," Gary muttered, staring down at his expensive sneakers. "Half the neighborhood is putting their houses on the market today. The other half is hiring an attorney to sue Diane for every dime in her retirement accounts. The board is completely bankrupt. We have enough in the reserve funds to keep the streetlights on for the rest of the year. But that's it." "So what happens next?" I asked, gripping the keys tightly. "We default," he said bitterly. "You keep the clubhouse, you keep the gates. We're officially dissolving the HOA charter on Friday. It's going to be an unmanaged subdivision. Property values are going to tank by 20% by the end of the week." He looked up at me then. His eyes were red-rimmed, watering slightly in the cold wind. There was anger there, but it was buried under a mountain of exhaustion. "I hope you're happy. You proved your point, Arthur. You burned the whole thing down." "I didn't want this, Gary," I said, and God, it was the absolute truth. The duffel bag at my feet felt like an anchor dragging me into the mud. I just wanted to paint my front door. I just wanted to be left alone. "Yeah, well," Gary said, turning his back to me and walking toward his car. "You got your wish. Nobody's going to bother you now." The Lexus engine purred to life. He drove away, his taillights bleeding red into the morning fog until they vanished around the bend. I stood alone on the front steps of a multi-million-dollar commercial property that I had no idea how to manage. I now owned a drained pool, an empty community center, and a mountain of property taxes I'd likely have to cover by liquidating the land to a commercial developer. It was going to be a grueling, endless nightmare of zoning board meetings and tax assessments. I had traded a neighborhood bully for a massive bureaucratic burden, but as the sun finally crested the horizon, casting a sharp, golden light across the subdivision, I looked down the hill toward my little half-acre. The old Ford Ranger was parked exactly where it wasn't supposed to be. The overgrown lawn was sparkling with morning dew, wild and untamed, and right in the center of the cracked, imperfect facade of my home, that freshly painted front door glowed a deep, brilliant, undeniable blue. I took a deep breath of the freezing air. I dropped the heavy brass keys into my pocket, picked up my canvas bag, and started the long walk home. And that's how a petty dispute over a painted door turned into me owning the ground the HOA stood on. Sometimes the universe hands you a shovel, and you just have to watch them dig their own grave. If you want to hear how I legally evicted a corrupt HOA president from our own clubhouse, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with anyone who's ever had to deal with a neighborhood tyrant. Thanks for listening.